Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We were just talking about the changes that were made in the draft, and one change is to enhance the child tax credit. And it was stated earlier by one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that there is a reduction in the refundability, maybe even no refundability in the child tax credit. That's just not true. In fact, the child tax credit is expanded, as Mr. Bartold has just said. It's an expansion from current law. So not only is the tax credit richer than it was before, it's a doubling of the child tax credit. It also is available to more families, and also the refundability of it is expanded. And I just think, again, if we can stick to the facts, for those who are watching, you might want to go on jct.gov, because that is the nonpartisan group that has analyzed this tax reform proposal. It was just said earlier, every income category gets a tax cut in the aggregate, and therefore, in the middle class, there are real tax cuts. In Ohio, the number that we've gotten is $2,375 per family per year. It will now be greater than that based on the changes that were made last night because the individual mandate funds are going into more middle-class tax cuts. So I would just encourage people to look at the Joint Committee numbers, which are the official numbers, and see the fact that despite what was said earlier today, if you want to tax middle class more, then you should vote no on this bill. If you want to give the middle class a tax cut, you should vote yes on this bill. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the other revisions you made in the modified mark. I think they make the bill better, including a bunch of bipartisan ideas that we already had in there, including middle class tax cut, including a territorial system at a 20% rate, which has been something that's been bipartisan in the past at least, a system that enables us to bring trillions of dollars from overseas back to this country for more investment, more jobs, and higher wages. That's already in the bill. But then you added some other bipartisan revisions that I think can be put in three categories. One, that promote more economic growth. Two, that promote the ability to save for retirement and promote employee ownership, which is a good thing in my view. And then finally, one that's just common sense. For economic growth, I want to thank the Chairman for including a provision that a lot of us have worked on for a long time, the Craft Beverage Modernization and Tax Reform Act. Senator Wyden has been a champion of this approach, and the growing craft beverage industry. This bill now gives these smaller companies much-needed excise tax relief that will allow these entrepreneurs to reinvest even more in their businesses and into our communities. Ohio's number 4 in the country now in craft beer production. We like that. The industry now supports about 15,000 jobs. 61 new breweries have opened just last year alone in Ohio. And this legislation is only going to promote the expansion and the jobs that come with these entrepreneurial small businesses. In the savings space, I'd like to thank the Chairman for accepting the amendment to the original Chairman's mark that protects the non-qualified deferred compensation and also the 401k catch-up contributions. What are these? The amendment protects in the non-qualified space the broad-based stock option plans, which are actually growing in this country. And I think that's a good thing. Among small startup businesses, they're really important. And this gives all employees a better stake in their company and the future of that company. We protect these stock option holders from income tax that would have been on phantom income they may never have received, which I believe would have been unfair. These types of savings vehicles, by the way, are critical to helping small employers attract new talent and for giving employees an ownership stake in the company they work for every day. The amendment also restores the ability for those over 50 years old to use the catch-up contribution in your 401k. This is something that Senator Ben Cardin, again, bipartisan idea, and I fought for. We got into the law several years ago. We want to make sure it stays in the law because we want to encourage people to save more for their retirement. So I think these are important changes. I appreciate you, Mr. Chairman, doing them. Finally, common sense. Senator Coons, another Democratic colleague of mine, and I have a bill called Stop Taxing Death and Disability Act. That's a pretty good title. What it says is that if someone has a child who develops a permanent disability, or if that child were to die tragically, then their student loans ought to be forgiven. And I think this is an improvement over current law as well. Maybe Mr. Bartold, if you're willing, you could walk us through how that works, what happens under present law when a child dies or develops a permanent disability and their student loans are forgiven, and what would happen under this legislation. We've had some tragic circumstances in my state of Ohio. One was the Carducci family in Steubenville, Ohio. Tragically, they had a child who developed a permanent disability, and yet they had a big student loan debt to pay, and this legislation would help them. If you would, Mr. Bartold, just speak briefly on this new legislation that's in the Chairman's mark today.
Certainly, Senator Portman. Under general tax principles and a feature of the Internal Revenue Code is forgiveness of any debt is considered an increase in income. And what your legislation would do would be in the situation where, more generally, where a student had student loan, often they are co-signed by a parent or a guardian, and they die by having co-signed or guaranteed the debt. That would become, if the loan is forgiven, as is often done on the death of the student, that becomes forgiveness of indebtedness to the guarantor, so to the parent, and they would otherwise have taxable income. And your legislation would make an exception from the general rule in that situation.
Well, and again, I think this is just common sense, and it's again an example of some of the changes in the chairman's mark last night that are bipartisan, that are broadly supported in this committee, and that will improve the legislation. Thank you.